probably be getting a new X-Men movie and franchise soon. So you know what that means. Time to revisit the original film franchise and talk about some of its more goofy moments. One of the weirdest things for me when I go back to the movies is the revelation that Jean is a doctor here. Dr. Jean Grey. Dr. Grey. This would, in ways, be incorporated into the comics, or I've seen it kind of come up sorta at certain moments. There have been versions of Jean who uses her psionic powers to basically learn how to be a medical doctor and then kind of like use those skills to treat others, thereby kind of becoming a doctor herself, although not, you know, formally. However, for the most part, this is not a part of Jean's canonical origins. At least not on Earth 616 it isn't. So it's always seemed weird to me in the movies that Jean just was going to be a doctor, that she was like, that's what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna be a doctor. I would say it's pretty different from Jean's focus in the comics, which tends to be more, I guess, emotional as opposed to like scientific or medical, if anything. For the most part, Jean is seen as simply an empathetic hero who works alongside the X-Men. That being said, I guess she could also have other pursuits, but in a way she feels like she's kind of filling in for the roles of Charles somewhat in the movies here, by being the person to like explain what mutants are from a genetic and evolutionary standpoint, which usually tends to be what Charles does in the comics. Something we've seen him do before anyways, since he's literally a man who is usually studied genetics, specializing in mutant genetics, so yeah. You know, something is really weird when I'm struggling to even find a clip of it to prove that I wasn't crazy in imagining it in terms of its existence. However, while I wasn't able to find the exact clip, I was able to find a lot of people on the internet who were able to back me up with their memories of this weird mutant power. So yay, thank you the internet. And next to we meet Jones, whose mutant power is seemingly to change the channel by blinking. Yep, I mean, I know there are a lot of weird mutant powers out there, but this feels weird even for mutants. Grant Morrison is often considered the writer most well known for going ham with weird mutants, so in this regard it could mean that the comics influenced us to get Jones, whose power could extend beyond changing the channel with blinks, but it's never really more clearly defined based on what we see of this mutant. I guess the difference is that in the comics our lovable weirdos like Glob Herman, Beak, or Eye-Boy tend to at least get some more development over time in regards to both their power sets and mutant abilities, and just who they are as people as well, I would say. Sadly, Jones did not get as much time as someone like Eye-Boy has. When I imagine Juggernaut in a film, I think Deadpool did the character more justice. Also fun to see that Ryan Reynolds was also the voice of Juggy in the films, kinda love it. In Deadpool 2, Juggernaut's helmet mostly obscures what appears to be a supersized, overly wide face. It feels as though Kane's power set modifies his look, making him a giant, strong man, as opposed to just, you know, someone who is granted super strength while remaining normal size because of his armor and because of Cyttorak and all that stuff. He is a beast in those films, made with the help of David Leitch CGI and being given a voice through Reynolds' portrayal of him. Whereas in the X-Men films he was played by, also I would say a badass, Vinnie Jones, but his appearance, costume, and stance just don't really sell us as much on the character. In fact, it kinda just makes Vinnie look ridiculous, which I also feel like is just silly because I do feel like Vinnie Jones could have been a good Juggernaut. Maybe that's a hot take, I don't know. Y'all can let me know in the comments if that's a hot take. Maybe one of the weirdest moments of all time from this series, this one comes to us from X-Men The Last Stand, and of course involves Juggernaut. Juggernaut already has been discussed. I mean, that costume is, like I said, it's a vibe for sure. But during X-Men The Last Stand, Juggernaut also decides to put on some attitude to match his look and menacing power set as well. At one point he says, in the vein of Britney Spears' "It's Britney, bitch. Don't you know who I am? I'm the Juggernaut, bitch." I mean, if you are trying to intimidate people, Kane, I think there are just like better lines you could have gone with. I know Kane isn't always shown to be the brightest bulb in the bunch, both inside and outside of the comics, but like, we know what his name is. It's not, that part is not very intimidating. I mean, I guess his name is the Juggernaut, so I guess that sounds, I mean, no, it just doesn't. It really doesn't. This line is just pretty goofy, especially when we look back at it. It also just seems weirdly unnecessary as well, to be honest. Just overall. Not necessarily a moment in the movie, but let's talk for a moment about Bryan Singer, who all in all is quite a complex individual, to put it lightly. Bryan Singer has been considered downright dastardly by some and condemned for both his onset and his offset behavior. But at the same time, there are others who have worked with him, specifically some of the cast of the X-Men films, who also felt that he was actually an amazing director despite his flaws. Sure, he wasn't always prepared or on time, and he was known to behave inappropriately, but there are actors who still were impressed by the fact that even sometimes without like seemingly like being super prepared. He knew how to get his shots and get what he needed out of his actors, so he could just come to set and he would just like bing bang boom, get it done. In that regard, most of the cast found themselves actually impressed with his abilities as a director, but there is also something that exists separate from, I would say, his behavior. He was never a fan of the X-Men comics. What? Which is pretty wild to consider, but it makes sense when you take a look at the films. For Singer, the appeal for the X-Men films was actually in exploring the analogy between the mutants and real-world prejudice and discrimination that certain people and groups face. Found that fascinating, and that's basically why he was like, I definitely want to do this. It looks cool. I don't want to read these comics, but I do want to do this comic book superhero movie. This one is both great and also awkward. It happened in X-Men First Class, and while overall it's actually honestly a pretty fun time, it's also a pretty weird scene when you have the context of like the original Fox X-Men films, where Magneto and Professor X at that point are more seen as elderly men, you know? This is back when the two are recruiting, and it is under this guise that they go to an adult dance club together. It's here that they encounter Angel. No, not that Angel. This Angel seems to be more based on Angel Salvador, and yeah, it's pretty awkward. Also kind of odd when you consider that Angel Salvador is actually a newer mutant who meets Charles when he is much older in the comics, so also just kind of strange in terms of that. This is a comic book moment in the worst way, and by that I mean it feels like just lazy and bad writing. Now, this is not something comic books are known for per se. I'm not saying that comic book stuff is lazy and bad writing, because usually that's not the case, but it is something that some of the worst comic book moments typically exhibit, like this movie-based comic book moment, which as far as I know isn't actually based off of anything specific from the comics, other than that sometimes, yes, Wolverine does suffer from muddled or completely wiped memories, and yes, he has been shot before in the head and that has messed up his memories. Usually though his memories get messed up because he's in some kind of facility where they have that tech, or because of trauma that he suffered in his life. However, here Stryker isn't using any fancy machine, but instead he's just hoping that adamantium bullets are gonna do the job. Very bizarre. What's even more bizarre is that this is the intent here. It's just to wipe his mind. That's his intent. Because he's not sure if he can actually kill Logan. How did he even know that this would work? This all goes down, of course, in X-Men Origins Wolverine, because that is where that would go down, isn't it? This machine is admittedly pretty ridiculous when you think about it, but as with most things in the Fox movies, it's just really better if you just don't think about it too much, you know? The mutant conversion machine was something that Magneto created to turn others into mutants. I mean, it didn't work long term, but it did work in the short term. In the first X-Men film, he kidnaps Senator Kelly and uses the machine on him. The whole idea of how it works is kind of wonky and very like kind of comic book science-y, with it even being powered by Magneto's own powers, which produced a mutant creating radiation field. Magnets, everyone. What can't they do? Both in the comics and in the films, apparently. I mean, you know me, I love a good goofy magnet moment as much as the next person. I just talked about all the weird ways that Magneto uses magnets over on my personal channel, but going back to this film and thinking about this machine, it's just a bit much, even for me. I'm cool with Magneto having his magnetic personality even, but using his powers to harness what is a mutant radiation field is just a bit too much for me in my mind. What does that even mean? That's about it. I'm your host, Amanda McKnight. Until next time, you stay nerdy.